Hello everybody, Jade Hamilton here, and today I've come on with my little Freya to do Theme Thursday, which is with Yvonne from Having You On, and to continue our story, which is Charm School by Anne Fine. We're going to do the tag first. As I say, I've got little Freya here with me, who takes a newborn side. Theme Thursday this week is frills. So Freya is in this beautiful little smock top and short set. It's this gorgeous lemon yellow and white gingham. It's got frills around the sleeves, which are little butterfly sleeves, frills around the bottom of the top, which is like a little peasant blouse smock top, and then underneath we've got some little frilled yellow gingham shorts. There's also a little garland of flowers around the neck in pink and white and sort of pale peach and yellow and duck egg blue. It's gorgeous. This is another of my purchases from Tiny Tots Pre-Loved, which is one of my favourite eBay stores. If you guys are like me and have got a lot of little ones, especially if you've got little ones who are lots of different sizes, please do go and check them out, because they are fabulous. Their pricing's really good. They have wonderful variety, and they deal with customers very well. They can buy in postage. They're just really helpful generally. So if you can get hold of them and have a look at their stock, please do. I'm particularly thinking of people like Jay and Dee over at the Baby Patch, and a lot of my other friends who have got lots and lots of babies of different ages and sizes and things. Right. Now, if you haven't subscribed to Yvonne already, Having You On, do. She's a lovely lady. She puts a lot of effort into the Theme Thursday themes, and she deserves a lot more subs. This little set, sorry, I'm all over the place today, is originally from Nutmeg, which is Morrison's clothing brand. And it's gorgeous. I absolutely love it, and it really suits Freya. She looks so adorable in it. The yellow really catches the yellow tones in her fur. She's a strawberry cheesecake ice cream Dairy Queen Build-A-Bear. She's quite old, because Build-A-Bear stopped making their ice cream bears in 2011. And I managed to get her on Vinted for a £5. She's also got this gorgeous pink trimmed bib on that has lots of cartoony fruits on it. It's got what look like blackberries and watermelon slices and apples and lemons, all with little smiley faces. This is lovely. This buttons up at the back. And I think it came to, it was at £1.50 in the end. And now on to our story, which is Chapter 6 of Charm School by Anne Fine. As per all videos where I read, all copyright goes to Anne Fine and to Random House. I own absolutely nothing. Make yourself comfortable, grab a drink if you've got one, grab an extra blanket if you're chilly, or a fan if you're warm. Make yourself nice and cosy. I'll get the story up and we'll get going. Chapter 6. Bonnie slid in the music tape and dropped into the revolving lantern the sheet that threw images of glittering rain, while Sarah Jane stood waiting for the excited chatter of the audience to die away. Bonnie signalled frantically at Araminta to move to the nearest loudspeaker, then whispered, "Don't throw the water." "Why not? Why not?" hissed back Araminta. "It'll be brilliant. Everyone will love it." Already Sarah Jane was stepping forward. "I can't explain," Bonnie whispered hastily. "There isn't time. But just don't throw it. Don't do anything. Promise?" Araminta shrugged, disappointed. But like a good friend, she answered trustingly, "Well, if you say so." Sarah Jane was explaining now. "This is a lovely little song and dance called Pretty Miss Raindrop. It starts with a great peal of thunder, so you mustn't be startled. And then I fall to earth in a glittering shower. There aren't many words to the song." She stopped, embarrassed. "Well, actually, the only words in it are drip, 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 but I do sing them over and over." More of a threat than a promise, Bonnie thought privately, but she obediently pressed play when Sarah Jane gave the signal. There was a moment's silence. Then from the speakers flowed the plaintive sound of violins. Bonnie waited for the thunder peal. Sarah Jane had told her 3 times over that this was the cue to switch on the glittering shower, but nothing like a peal of thunder came, only the music rising and falling like souls lost in grief. Bonnie peeked through the glass. Sarah Jane looked positively stricken. Could this be the wrong music? She glanced at the empty tape box. Yes, it was number 4. But in the rush to speak to Araminta after Toby's warning, might she have slid... Yes, it was number 4, but in the rush to speak to Araminta after Toby's warning, might she have slid it in on the wrong side? Oh no! Toby would kill her when he realised something was wrong. In desperate hope, Bonnie held on for 1 or 2 more bars, just in case the thunder came. But it was hopeless. It didn't sound at all the right sort of music for rushing round being a raindrop. Clearly the only thing to do was take out the tape and start again. Sarah Jane looked more and more panicked as the wrong music pulled up behind her, and a great scowl was gathering on Toby's face. Bonnie's finger reached out for the stop button. But just at that moment, Sarah Jane threw back her head and opened her mouth wide. Bonnie hesitated. Had she decided to press on and sing whatever it was she'd recorded on the other side? The haunting melody rose, and out of Sarah Jane's mouth there poured a waterfall of notes so pure and lovely that Bonnie's hand froze from sheer enchantment. Dark my days and dark my hours, since Lord Harry broke my heart. I'll forsake these golden bowers, and the seas of grief I'll chart. Behind her, Toby moved closer to the glass. Already the glare on his face had cleared. He looked entranced, and Bonnie could see the fingers on his left hand twitching, as though, as he listened, he was playing the melody along with his precious Sarah Jane on some imaginary violin. The glorious voice poured out of the loudspeakers. Even Araminta had put down the bucket and stopped looking wistful as she listened. Lost my hopes and lost my beauty, since Lord Harry rode away. Was there ever such a cruelty? Was there ever such dismay? The lovely voice soared, even if Toby weren't in the way, rapt and unreachable. There was no need for Bonnie to switch on any glittering showers. Sarah Jane's voice alone could glitter and sparkle, flash and blaze. If she could sing like this and steal their hearts, why should she bother even to step out of the bright circle of light? That was all Bonnie offered. Will Lord Henry hear my singing even? Will I charm him back to me? In his ears my verses ringing, in his heart my melody. The music swelled and died. The song was over. Sarah Jane hung her head, deeply embarrassed, and for a moment or two there was no sound at all. Beside Bonnie, Toby stared uneasily. Beyond the glass, the clapping started. Araminta put the bucket back where it was supposed to be, and Mrs. Opperline dabbed at her eyes with the frilly lace handkerchiefs. Toby's eyes shifted to the audience. Where's whose is that space next to Sarah Jane's? It's Araminta's. She's not using it. Instantly he was at the door. Silly to waste it. Did he even hear her? She didn't think so. He'd already gone. Bonnie sighed heavily, and after all those lofty speeches about silly girls, though to be fair he'd stuck with just feeling soft until he'd heard her singing beautifully, it was her talent, not her pretty face, that had bewitched his heart. As he slipped into Araminta's empty seat, Mrs. Opperline arose from her own overfull one. My dearest Sarah Jane, she said, still plainly moved, that was incomparable. Nobody knew what incomparable meant, but it was obvious it was a compliment of the highest order, so everyone happily nodded along. And after that, it was quite clear that Mrs. Opperling was almost as taken with the new style as Curls and Pearls show as her pupils. Memorable, dear, memorable, she said, enchanted, after Lulu's cowboy sweetheart song, when Araminta popped up behind the cardboard stockade, wearing the bison horn she'd found in the stockroom, and Bonnie turned on the tornado and sent tumbleweed bouncing across the prairie backdrop. Exotic! She marvelled after firework explosions shook the stage all through Cristal's lullaby. Rivetingly tasteless, dear, was her judgment after Angelica's Beauty and the Beast song, Beauty and Her Mirror song, during which Bonnie fiddled with the lighting until Angelica aged horribly before their eyes, then turned into a skull. Disquietingly vertiginous, she said, when Araminta's own turn finally came round, and Bonnie made the snowflakes swirl so fast that Araminta finally got dizzy and fell over. And how Bonnie managed to turn Cookie's pretty fairy ring of mushrooms into the waterlogged swamp of crocodiles, Mrs. Zoppeline swore she'd never know. At last it was over. Cindy Lou swatted out fiercely one last time at all the shadow bats that had so mysteriously swooped in to join her gracious tea time with the vicar mime. Down came the curtains, and Mrs. Opperline sailed up the stairs and stood on the stage apron. "Well, dears," she declared, "that was..." And for the first time in her life, Mrs. Opperline was lost for words. "Such fun!" said Araminta, coming out of the wings and hugging Mrs. Opperline. "Such wonderful fun!" "Marvellous!" called out Lulu. "Fabulous! Terrific!" Pearl hugged herself. "It was," she breathed in ecstasy, "the very best Curls and Pearls show ever." Mrs. Opperline capitulated graciously. "What's that, Freya?" "What's capitulated?" "Oh, capitulated means you've given in to something. When you say to somebody, 'I give up,' you win." Poor old Mrs. Opperline. I don't think she really thinks it's the best ever Curls and Pearls show, does she? No. But because everybody else does, she's decided to agree, hasn't she? And that's what capitulated means. It's where you go, "I give up, you win." Mrs. Opperline capitulated graciously even. "Yes, dears, I do agree it made the most amusing and interesting change, and we must certainly think of doing it that way again some other time." "Not just some other time, Mrs. Opperline. Next time. Not just next time, Mrs. Opperline. Every time." Mrs. Opperline looked down at them, startled. Where were her modest and amiable girls with whom she'd spent the morning? Sitting in front of her now were a crowd of smudged, untidy urchins, fidgeting and grinning and calling out uncurbed. "Now, girls," she reproved them, "aren't we beginning to forget that we tried to stay very best friends with Miss Manners?" At the words "very best friends," Araminta swiveled in her seat and blew a sparkling Araminta-ish kiss at Bonnie through the glass. Bonnie had never been blown a kiss before. Like lots of the other things in charm school that day, it was a first. She blew it back while Mrs. Opperline went on with her lecture. "In fact, dears, ladies never shout out like this when they want something. They simply think of a roundabout way of suggesting it nicely, in the hope that..." But no one was listening. "Mrs. Opperline!" Pearl's voice rose over the others. "This was such fun that I don't think I could go back to doing it the old way. There was just too much sitting around and waiting. and watching everyone else mince up and down looking pretty was boring too. She sighed wistfully. I had such fun today. Amethyst was brilliant. I wish I could act like that. Suddenly a thought struck her. Do they do acting classes here as well? Some of those listening couldn't help noticing there was a shade of bitterness in Bonnie's voice as it came through the loudspeaker. Yes, there are acting classes, but they don't start till next week. Once again, Mrs. Opperline found herself facing unladylike chaos. Acting, yes! Oh, I'd adore to learn to act. And there are painting classes too. If there were, I'd go to them. Then I could paint Amethyst an even creepier forest backdrop. Saturdays, Bonnie informed Suki. 2 till 4. Bring your own paints. Sarah Jane should take up singing or choir. If I had a voice as lovely as hers, I wouldn't want to waste it. Tuesdays at 6. I've always wanted to learn juggling, personally. Thursdays, from January to April. Did you see the tornado and the prairie and the swamp full of crocodiles? I'd love to know more about those sorts of things. Natural geography. Bonnie informed her through the loudspeakers. On Wednesdays at lunchtime, repeated Friday nights. Mrs. Opperline saw her class melting away before her eyes. Girls, she said. Perhaps pearls are 8. Maybe it would be nice to, she wondered how to put it, broaden out a little. What? Learn a few other things, like how to work the lights and the sound, and make people laugh and tell jokes and juggle. Excellent! In that case, I'll certainly be coming back. Me too, and me. Mrs. Opperline looked thrilled. Really, dears? Oh, I'm so pleased. And maybe next time we'll get to find a few extra things to interest everyone. A dreamy look spread over Cookie's face. I'll tell you what interested me. Those astonishing fireworks. They were breathtaking. My breath, Christelle reminded her. I was so terrified I could hardly finish my lullaby. Oh, but they look so real. I love them. The dreamy look sparkled. Do you suppose we could broaden out enough to learn how to make fireworks, Mrs. Opperline? Mrs. Opperline blanched. What's that, Freya? What's blanched? It means she went white. Because I don't think she likes the idea of Cookie trying to blow things up in her nice charm school, do you? No, I don't think I would either. Although learning how to make things go bang does sound fun, doesn't it? I had a teacher at school, a guy called Mr. Lazelle. Wonderful man. He's no longer with us now, may he rest in peace. But he was a specialist in biology and chemistry, and he always used to say the best things about science are learning how to turn things pretty colours and learning how to make things go bang. So whenever he had to do an assembly, that's what he did. And I remember one particular assembly where he got a lot of Bunsen burners out. I don't know if anybody outside the UK has come across a Bunsen burner. They're a little contraption with a gas flame at the top, and you stick a beaker or a trivet with a little bit of whatever chemical it is, and you use the Bunsen burner to heat it and do interesting things with it. But what Mr. Lazelle did was he had this line of Bunsen burners. There were 7 of them, and with each Bunsen burner he put a different chemical into the flame, and they were in rainbow order. So there was one that had strontium in it, which glowed red. There was one that had, I think, was it sodium in it, that glowed orange. There was one that glowed yellow. There was one that turned bright blue, one that went green, one that went a sort of pinky colour, crimsony colour, and one that went violet. And it was a really, really cool spectacle. We turned out all the lights so that we could see everything. It was brilliant. I imagine Cookie would love something like that. Mrs. Opaline blanched. No, dear, I don't think so. I fear if we took up with flashes and explosions, we'd end up stepping on Dr. Hooper's toes. Who's Dr. Hooper? Chemistry, Bonnie informed them. Tuesdays at 5. She couldn't help adding, with the tinge of bitterness they'd all come to recognise. But that's another class that doesn't start till September. That's fine, I'll wait, said Cookie. Do you want to come with me, Angelica? No, Angelica was adamant. I'm definitely off to do geography. How odd, thought Bonnie, still in the control room. Only this morning they'd be wishing one another away sick in bed or off on holiday, so there'd be fewer of them to win the glistering tiara. Now they were asking one another to come along to these new classes, even the ones who hadn't seen good friends before. Lulu, will you come? Lulu was torn. The fireworks were lovely, but no, I'm still going to choose painting. Mrs. Opaline looked crestfallen. Mrs. Opaline looked crestfallen. Suki consoled her. Never mind, you mustn't worry. You'll still have plenty of people, because now we won't just be walking in boring old beauty all the time. A lot of our friends will probably stop coming too. Mrs. Opaline clapped her hands eagerly. Oh, do you think so? I'm sure so, now that we won't be spending all our time suffering to be beautiful. Cookie looked up. If we don't have to suffer to get into those frocks all the time, then I'll come back to charm school as well as chemistry. Under her breath, she added mischievously, and I'll have 2 slices of pizza if I'm hungry. I'll carry on coming as well. Me too, and me. Mrs. Opaline cheered up. Well, dears, she said, perhaps it's all for the best. I've been giving these classes for years and years, and times do change. If you're all busy doing all those other interesting things, you simply won't have quite so much time to sit with your elbows in lemon hubs and wander around the shops looking for just the right thing. Her eye fell on Toby, holding Sarah Jane's hand. Though I do hope, with whatever you're all busy doing, you will always try to and remember how to behave. A thought struck Araminta suddenly. our charm school motto? Now we won't be suffering anymore. Mrs. Opperlein looked anxious. Oh dear. I know, cried Lulu. How about handsome is as handsome does? What about beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Called out Esmeralda. I quite like beauty is truth, truth beauty. Now, quoted Cookie. I like that one too. That's one from the poet John Keats, who I mentioned in yesterday's video. It's from his poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, which is a poem I studied for my A-levels, and I've always really liked it. And the line finishes, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know, which is rather lovely. Horrified, Mrs. Opperlein put up her hand to storm the rising tide of heresy. Sorry, Fran, what's heresy? It's when you do something that you shouldn't do, based on the rules of it. It comes from religion. It's a very sort of grown-up concept. It's not something you have to worry about, I don't think, darling. It's difficult to explain, but Mummy will try later, okay? Shall we leave that till later, dears? For the moment, let's just decide who we're going to crown the Supreme Queen, and then we'll do all those other things next time. Next time. Bonnie looked round at the chaos in the control room. And wondered what on earth the famous Mora would think of all the mess when she came back. Leaping off her swivel chair, she hastily started putting things away in boxes. She didn't want Mora complaining to Mrs. Opperlein. Mrs. Opperlein might not be keen to have her back, and she might want to come. After all, if charm school was, as she'd hoped, about to turn into fun school, it would be a wonderful way of spending time with Araminta, though they might even turn out to be in the same school, in the same class even. Thinking how wonderful this would be, Bonnie stuffed away one slide and stencil after another into what she hoped were the right places. She was still busy putting things away when Araminta burst in. Ah! Bonnie joked. Just the person I need! Miss Tidy Thy Nature! But Araminta wasn't listening. Rushing to a little cabinet on the wall, she unlocked it and carefully drew out a beautiful sparkling tiara set on a flat satin cushion with shimmering crystal beads. Holding it reverently, she walked past Bonnie, busy on her knees, and carried it back to Mrs. Opperlein. Mrs. Opperlein held it high. I wish there was one for everybody. Everybody, she said. You all give such fine performances. It's so hard to decide. And we never even got around to doing the catwalk parade, which might have helped me choose the winner properly. We can still do that now, suggested Angelica. Mrs. Opperlein looked down at them all and shuddered. I don't think so, dear. You all look a little bit... The word was scruffy, but it seemed so rude. Unpolished. And I'm afraid I somehow mislaid my marking pad while that frightful Wolverine was growling at Amethyst. So, dears, I'm horribly afraid I'm not quite sure who ought to be. But Araminta was on her feet again in her excitement. It's obvious, Mrs. Opperlein. There's someone here who won it fair and square. Amethyst made us scream with terror stuck in that awful forest. And Serena made us laugh ourselves silly tumbling into that well. And Sarah Jane made us cry with her beautiful singing. In the interest of honesty, she amended this. Well, some of us, she added politely. But who made us do all those things? They were silent. In their heart of hearts, each of them knew that but for one person, at this very moment they'd have been mincing up and down the catwalk in their pretty frocks, trying to look beautiful enough to win the glistering tiara. And instead of bouncing up and down excitedly on their seats as they were now, making interesting plans for the future, all of them, all except one of them, would have gone home and sobbed into her pillows, feeling nothing but clumsy or podgy or ugly. It was a struggle, but they'd had a brilliant afternoon and there were good times to come. All right, that's fair enough. Yes, I agree. She did a spectacular show. Those bats, those rats. Personally, I loved the tumbleweed. Do you suppose I should be thinking of classes in botany? Deep in her boxes, Bonnie overheard the word botany coming through the sound system. Mondays, she called out automatically. Between 6 and 8, with optional Saturday field trips. Once again, Mrs. Opaline had visions of a vanishing class. Right then, she added hastily. Since you all agree, the glistering tiara goes to... Everyone shouted it together. Miss Sparky! Startled, Bonnie looked up from her tidying. What? Miss Sparky! Mrs. Opaline called out again. Our own supreme queen. Time to be crowned, dear, with our lovely glistering tiara. All the blood drained from Bonnie's face. Oh no! Staying on all fours, she made for the door. The knees of her jeans picked up huge dirty smudges, but she didn't care. She just kept her head down and carried on scuttling towards the huge green glowing sign that promised exit. 2 leggy pillars suddenly barred her way. Toby, and where do you think you're going? Home, Bonnie whispered. Quickly, before they get me. They're not planning on hanging you, Toby pointed out. They simply want to make you supreme queen. Well, it's ridiculous. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Well, Toby said judiciously, I do agree that it's a little strange that you should be the winner. A huge soppy smile spread over his face. I mean, it is a bit difficult to see how anyone could have chosen you after that touching and heart-rending song about Lord Henry. Excuse me, Bonnie interrupted tartly, but if it wasn't for me, your precious Sarah Jane would have sung a song that goes drip, drip, drip. But that was just your mistake. He was quite right, of course, but he'd annoyed her. For a moment, she couldn't think of any suitable retort. And then Mrs. Opaline's words came back to her about reaching the heights of fashion, and she told him loftily, on the contrary, it was a combination of vision and planning and hard work. He looked impressed. Oh, well, he said, in that case, fair enough after all. Sarah Jane probably has a whole lifetime of... Fair enough. After all, Sarah Jane has a whole lifetime of singing prizes in front of her. He blushed. In fact, she's going to let me accompany her on my violin. So now I really do need a better one. I wouldn't mind doing this boring job so much each Saturday. If Mrs. Opperline's classes go the way I think they're going, Bonnie said, your job won't be so boring in future. True, he looked delighted. Well then, he said, you seem to have sorted out just about everyone in one short day. I definitely think that you deserve that glistering tiara. Bonnie thought about it for a moment. She looked at all the lamps and equipment she'd worked so hard to learn to handle so they could have their brilliant show, and she thought of all the changes she'd made for them. And she thought of Araminta. Yes, she agreed. I think that I deserve it too. I've earned it fair and square. I'll wear it with pride. Good, Toby said, and Sarah Jane can be crowned with my admiration instead. That's nice, said Bonnie. She'll look good in that. And laughing, she walked out as Toby opened the door for her, bowing like a footman. Everyone was waiting. Mrs. Opperline beamed. Ah, there you are, dear. It is a pity that we don't have time to dress you up a bit, just for the presentation. You would have looked such a treat in Cindy Lou's blushing rose frock. But never mind, we must just make the best of things. Best of things. Obligingly, Bonnie dusted the knees of her jeans before walking up the steps. Mrs. Opperline held the glistering tiara aloft. Its rhinestones sparkled, and the sequins sewn onto its velvet trim twinkled in the gleam of the one spotlight Bonnie hadn't yet switched off. It gives me inordinate pleasure, said Mrs. Opperline, to place this precious crowning glory on the head of our most deserving Miss Supreme Queen, Miss Sparky. None of them knew what inordinate meant, but they cheered anyway as Mrs. Opperline wedged the tiara firmly on the unruly wedge of Bonnie's hair, and Cindy Lou took a photo. There, dear, don't you look nice? Bonnie could see her reflection in every mirror round the room. See from her reflection in every mirror round the room that hers would be the first photograph on the corridor outside to show a grimy face with unbrushed hair wearing the prized tiara. Her look of triumph, though, would fit in very well. Thank you, she told them all. Thank you. I've had a wonderful day. I can't remember when I last had so much fun. I'm really glad I chose to come to Charm School. Are you, dear? Mrs. Opperline was thrilled. Bonnie couldn't help hugging her. Yes, I am. And I'll be back again next time if you'll let me. My dear, we'd be honoured, Mrs. Opperline said. Honoured and charmed. The rest of the afternoon passed by in a flash of tidying and laughing and swapping jokes and stories and putting away chairs and exchanging phone numbers and addresses. It seemed to Bonnie it was half an hour at most before Mrs. Opperline finally ushered the last of them out into the corridor and along to the lift. Bye, dears. Take good care. See you all next time. Bye, Mrs. Opperline. Bye. On the ground floor, Bonnie spilled out of the lift, surrounded by chattering girls. Beside the desk, Mrs. Bramble stood, holding her certificate and talking to the lady who'd sold them their tickets. Both of them stared as Bonnie rushed over to greet them. Neither could understand how that sour and resentful creature from whom they'd parted that morning could have turned into the bubbling, excited person in front of them now. Mum, come and meet Minty! She pointed to the group of girls. And Cookie, and Lulu, and Esmeralda, and Cindy Lou, and... Mrs. Bramble waved her certificate in Bonnie's face. Snatching it, Bonnie inspected her mother's name on the dotted line, then hugged her proudly. You did it! Brilliant! Well done! What about you? Asked Mrs. Bramble, and then, unable to deny the evidence of of Bonnie's shining eyes and all the gay girls gathering round her, she risked the tiniest little tease. A little bit better than you expected, was it? Bonnie's face was radiant. Better? It was brilliant! I learned so much and made so many friends. I even won their funny old glistering tiara. And I'd miss Sparky for a whole year. And Minty's going to phone me tonight if the phone's on yet. And Mum, can I come back again next time Mrs. Opperline runs charm school? Oh, please, please, please. I'll help unpack all the packing cases and the plates and dishes and things and put things away in cupboards and... She reached for her mother's basket. Oh, let me carry all those heavy accounting books. You must be tired. I'll take these to the car. Mrs. Bramble stared at her daughter. What on earth had happened all day up there on the 3rd floor? What on earth was the glistering tiara? How would you get to be a Miss Sparky? And who was this Mrs. Opperline who'd weaved such magic over the miserable son and daughter she'd been arguing with that morning? No time to talk now. Bonnie was frantically waving and calling to a couple leaving arm in arm. Bye, Toby! Bye, Sarah Jane! In fact, she didn't stop waving and calling out her merry goodbyes to her new friends till they were safely in the car. Mrs. Bramble could hardly believe it. Only one day at charm school. But it worked. Oh, so Bonnie's mummy has been a little bit tricky, hasn't she? She's used charm school to help get Bonnie out of her grump and make some new friends. And it worked, didn't it? Bonnie's clearly had a lovely time and she got to win the tiara in the end. That was brilliant, wasn't it? Well done, Bonnie. So that's the end of our story. I really hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching, subscribing, commenting. It really makes my day when you do. And Freya and I will hopefully see you soon for another story. Thanks so much, everybody. Cheerio. Can you wave, Freya? Good girl. Bye, everybody. Cheerio.